The Lethal Weapon franchise almost stopped at 2 movies, and that's because the original plan was to kill off Riggs in the second one. Not only that, but Lorna in Lethal Weapon 3 was originally meant to be a male, and intended as Riggs' equal, someone just as lethal and crazy as he is. Additionally, Lethal Weapon 4, besides being an incredibly chaotic shoot that started production without a finished script, was originally about Riggs and Murtaugh investigating a neo-Nazi group committing terrorist attacks in LA. But what about Lethal Weapon 5? What might that have been like? To answer that question, let's dive in and explore the original plans for the first 4 Lethal Weapon films, and also take a look at what could have been Lethal Weapon 5. In 1985, recent UCLA graduate Shane Black was inspired by Dirty Harry to write his own urban western, reimagining the classic trope of the old gunslinger and transforming him into a violent killer, trained as special forces during the Vietnam War, now living in a gentrified suburban community. Set in Los Angeles, the film's location was meant to symbolize the Wild West, after it had been tamed, but with danger still lurking beneath the surface. This character, capable of heinous acts, is haunted by his past, and ostracized for his violent and unpredictable nature. Yet, when danger comes to this peaceful community, the people have no choice but to turn to the violent gunslinger for help. This archetype is not unlike John Wayne's character in The Searchers, another deeply flawed gunslinger, haunted by his past and forced to confront the very violence that isolates him from the community he protects. Black's script also drew from his love of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, a buddy movie and classic western, which shaped Riggs and Murtaugh's relationship, bringing conflict, camaraderie, and humor to the core of Lethal Weapon. Another trademark of the film was its Christmas setting, which would become a hallmark of Black's films moving forward. For Black, Christmas wasn't just a festive backdrop, but a psychological anchor that added layers of depth to his stories. He found inspiration in films like 3 Days of the Condor, where the muted joy of Christmas carolers contrasted starkly with the tension of a high-stakes chase. Black believed that the holiday created a magical backdrop, a time of reflection and momentary time out in people's lives that amplified emotions. Loneliness felt lonelier, if you're sad you're morose, and moments of redemption hit harder. In Lethal Weapon, the Christmas setting underscores Riggs' journey from a suicidal cop who learns that his life has worth, mirroring the timeless classic It's a Wonderful Life, although Black admits he hadn't seen it when he wrote it. To get this script noticed, Black spiced up his writing, tailoring it to hold the attention of weary Hollywood script readers who slog through countless scripts each day. For example, when describing a posh Beverly Hills house in the script, he wrote that it's the type of house he'd buy if the movie is a huge hit, and it worked, as Black would sell the script for $250,000. However, his original version of the script was somewhat different than what ended up on screen. According to Black, he called the first draft the kitchen sink version, because action scenes were much bigger and thus more expensive. For example, the original ending featured Mr. Joshua and the General escaping in a truck while being pursued by a police helicopter. In an attempt to lose it, Joshua fires a rocket launcher at the helicopter, causing it to crash into the Hollywood sign, setting it ablaze. Later, the truck full of heroin explodes, causing it to snow in Hollywood. Riggs also kills Mr. Joshua at the end by punching his nose into his brain, which Black would later reuse for The Last Boy Scout. And speaking of The Last Boy Scout, Bruce Willis was originally offered the part of Riggs in Lethal Weapon, but he turned it down because his then girlfriend felt the script was too violent. Likewise, Mel Gibson would turn down Die Hard, the film that would launch Willis to superstardom, because he didn't want to be crawling around in vents for the entire shoot. Riggs' famous suicide scene was also originally written with Riggs taking a handful of pills, but after trying to shoot the scene and feeling it wasn't working, Gibson suggested that Riggs as a cop would use a service revolver to kill himself and wouldn't try to OD on pills. Black's first draft was also much darker. For example, Black had written a scene earlier in the film with a sniper shooting kids at an elementary school. Riggs arrives, stands out in the open in the line of fire to demonstrate the character's death wish, and empties his clip into the shooter. Director Richard Donner, who was hired after Leonard Nimoy passed to direct Three Men and a Baby because he was uncomfortable directing action, felt this scene and others were too dark. As a result, he asked writer Jeffrey Boehm to lighten the script and add more humor. For example, Boehm replaced this scene with the Christmas tree lot scene that sees Riggs working undercover before the deal goes south, as he's taken hostage as he begs the assailant to kill him. It's also worth noting that Boehm was a writer on another Richard Donner production, The Lost Boys, which is why that film's marquee was included as an Easter egg in Lethal Weapon. The opening and closing to the film was also originally different. Originally, we first meet Riggs drinking alone in a bar, as a couple of thugs try to attack him for money, but are swiftly subdued. While this scene highlighted Riggs' training, director Richard Donner opted for a different introduction to the character, replacing it with him waking up in his trailer, lonely and depressed. The original ending also saw Riggs and Murtaugh go their separate ways, but Donner, apparently not even thinking of sequels, felt the film should end with Murtaugh inviting Riggs over to spend Christmas with his family, after Riggs gives him the bullet he was going to kill himself with, signifying that Riggs has found a new sense of purpose and belonging, leaving his suicidal tendencies behind. However, it's also been rumored that Warner Brothers asked Donner to reshoot the ending, seeing big money in a sequel. After the enormous success of the first film, it seemed only natural that writer Shane Black be the one to pen the sequel, and he'd write it with the help from his friend, novelist Warren Murphy, since Black was struggling with depression at the time after breaking up with his girlfriend. Black would channel this dark period of his life into the script, as he'd make the South African villains more dangerous through their acts of violence and torture. For example, Shapiro, the female police officer working with Riggs and Murtaugh, would have been tortured to death by the South Africans. Riggs also would have been tortured by them in a scene that was allegedly considerably worse than his torture scene in the first film. Joe Pesci's character, Leo Getz, was originally only a minor character, with only one scene and a few lines of dialogue. After the role was expanded and Pesci was cast, he was inspired by young Disneyland employees who always smiled, and the first thing they'd say to you if you asked them a question like how to get to Fantasyland would be, okay, Fantasyland, okay. And while this would become Leo's catchphrase in the film, it would also appear as an Easter egg a year later in Home Alone, on the side of Pesci's van. Black wanted to focus less on comedy, which would come to define the series, and more on heroism, as he felt it made sense to take Riggs, who in the first film was a reckless cop with no fear of death, and turn him into a courageous partner in this film, who's willing to sacrifice his life for Murtaugh after he and his family gave him a second chance at life. In the first film, Riggs is a lethal weapon, not just because of his elite combat training, but because of his suicidal tendencies and unpredictable nature. However, in the sequels, Riggs becomes more grounded, shifting from a volatile character to a more stable and comedic partner, dulling the meaning behind the title of the series and making his character less compelling. Shane Black has spoken about his frustration with the direction of the sequels, emphasizing his belief that the first film told a complete story about Riggs' transformation. Black's reluctance to work on the later sequels stemmed from his feeling that they lacked a strong reason to exist, believing that the title, Lethal Weapon, and the character of Riggs had lost their weight. When asked if he'd be interested in writing the fourth film, Black would say, "What is Lethal Weapon 4? Why is Lethal Weapon 4? This is why Black didn't want to call his sequel Lethal Weapon 2, feeling the title no longer fit. Instead, he called it Play Dirty, inspired by the ruthless tactics of the South African villains. The Peter Vorstedt character, originally named Benedict, was originally a way more dangerous antagonist in Black's original script, as he'd be written as Riggs' arch nemesis and worst nightmare, and it would be this character who would ultimately kill Riggs. After the destruction of the Stilt House, Riggs chases him into a big bushfire in the Hollywood Hills, where Riggs gets stabbed and dies slowly from his wounds. Afterwards, Murtaugh watches a videotape that was sent to his house, that Riggs recorded beforehand, knowing he might not survive, in which he says goodbye to Murtaugh. Black would later say this script was the best thing he ever wrote, and Riggs' death scene was beautiful and would have made the audience cry. However, when Black turned in the script, the studio balked at killing off Riggs, which producer Joel Silver claimed happened in the second act. However, Black doesn't believe it was the studio who was against making the script, but rather director Richard Donner, who Black said was a cheerful guy who wanted to make a more upbeat movie. Feeling like he let everyone down, Black offered to give the money for writing the sequel back, but was stopped by his agent, who told him people in this industry write garbage and still get paid millions of dollars. To rewrite it, Donner would once again turn to Jeffrey Boehm, who did uncredited rewrites on the first film and would get sole screenwriting credit this time around, although Black and his writing partner Warren Murphy would still be credited for the story, as Black would say he recognized things when he watched the final movie that were in his original script, but the tone was totally different. For example, a surfboard flies through the air and kills a guy, and Mel Gibson quips, "Wipeout." Black would later say he wouldn't have done that, and it was just a dumb joke. Same goes for the famous "they F you in the drive-thru" scene, which Black said came out of an improv, as Donner just liked to get the cast together and let the guys be guys and have fun. However, Richard Donner still explored ending the film with Riggs dying, and shot two different endings. The one that saw Riggs die ends with the camera moving away from Murtaugh, holding Riggs' lifeless body. Donner would eventually test screen both endings, with audiences preferring the one in which Riggs survives. Additionally, Riggs' love interest Rika was meant to survive, with the film ending on a lighter note as Riggs and Rika joined the Murtaughs for Thanksgiving dinner. However, Donner chose to kill her off, in order to heighten Riggs' motivation for taking down the South African drug smugglers. For Lethal Weapon 3, Shane Black wasn't asked back. In fact, Black stopped writing for a few years after his disappointing experience on Lethal Weapon 2, before returning with The Last Boy Scout. Instead, Jeffrey Boehm returned to write the third entry in the series, and in his original draft, the character of Lorna was written as a male, intended to be Riggs' equal, someone just as lethal and crazy as he was. Instead, Instead, Riggs' love interest would have been Murtaugh's daughter, the seeds of which had been planted all the way back in the first film. This is why in the final version of Lethal Weapon 3 there are still echoes of Murtaugh's suspicion that Riggs and Rianne are having an affair, like when Riggs tells Murtaugh Rianne came to see him at his trailer, or later when he reveals that he slept with someone he probably shouldn't have, resulting in Murtaugh punching him, thinking he met his daughter. Eventually, Donner requested this subplot be nixed, and for Boehm to turn the new Riggs-like character into a woman, and make her Riggs' love interest instead. Leo Getz also wasn't anywhere in this version, with it being explained that he went to New York, until Donner asked Boehm to include him in the script. Winona Ryder was Donner's first choice to play Lorna, but producer Joel Silver felt she was too young for the part. Despite Silver's objections, Donner offered her the role anyway, but Ryder ultimately declined, as she was not only busy filming Dracula, but allegedly had little interest in doing an action movie. Unsatisfied with Boehm's script, Donner brought in writer Robert Mark Kamen, who wrote The Karate Kid and did uncredited rewrites to the South African villain scenes in Lethal Weapon 2 to start over from scratch. However, according to Boehm, Donner was distracted developing the film Radio Flyer and didn't have the patience, energy, or time to really devote to the development of Lethal Weapon 3, so he brought in Kamen to try and jumpstart his interest in the project by going in a new direction. However, Donner wasn't satisfied with Kamen's work and ended up going back to Boehm in his previous draft. Not only that, but Star Wars' Carrie Fisher was also brought in to do uncredited rewrites on the film, as she had developed a second career as one of Hollywood's best script doctors. Additionally, the script was rewritten constantly throughout filming, so if the third Lethal Weapon film felt weaker than its predecessors, the film's revolving door of writers is likely to blame, a problem that would only worsen with Lethal Weapon 4. Despite its perceived shortcomings, Lethal Weapon 3 was a massive success, becoming the highest-grossing film in the franchise. Riding high on its popularity, producer Joel Silver attempted to acquire a spec script titled Simon Says, about a police detective and shopkeeper working together to stop a series of bomb threats planted across the city. However, Fox beat him to it, rewriting the script, which was originally meant as a starring vehicle for Brandon Lee, who had tragically passed away, into Die Hard with a Vengeance. However, if Silver had secured the rights, it would have been Riggs and Murtaugh, not McClane and Zeus, racing around Los Angeles to defuse bombs. Instead, writer Jonathan Lemkin, who had done uncredited rewrites on Demolition Man and Indiana Jones 4, was brought in, and his idea was pretty similar to the finished film, involving the Chinese triads. Not only that, but the plan was to get another writer to concurrently write Lethal Weapon 5, and then shoot both sequels back to back. However, Silver wasn't satisfied with Lemkin's script, so yet again went back to Jeffrey Boehm to fix it up. Boehm, though, wasn't a fan of the storyline, believing that a plot about counterfeiting Chinese money lacked the tension and excitement needed for a Lethal Weapon sequel. As a result, he started from scratch, reimagining Lethal Weapon 4 with Riggs and Murtaugh investigating a neo-Nazi group plotting attacks on minorities to ignite a racial holy war, with one scene featuring the group using Stinger missiles to attempt to shoot down a jet carrying the Los Angeles Lakers. However, Boehm's script was ultimately rejected for being too dark. As the script continued to be developed by a plethora of different writers, Warner Bros. Found itself in hot water after the failure of Batman and Robin and The Postman, as well as the cancellation of Tim Burton's Superman Lives and Ridley Scott's I Am Legend, which would have starred Schwarzenegger. Desperately in need of a hit, they rushed Lethal Weapon 4 into production, returning to the original story of the Chinese triads, due to the popularity of films focusing on martial arts in the late 90s, as Warner Bros. Looked to capitalize on the trend's success. The script, though, wouldn't be finished before production began. Not only that, it was proving difficult to get the entire cast to return, with Mel Gibson saying he wasn't interested in making a fourth film, suggesting Warner Bros. Should send any scripts developed for the film over to Bruce Willis to become Die Hard sequels instead. Even Joe Pesci was reluctant to return, which is why his character, Leo Getz, wasn't included in the initial drafts of the script. Eventually, Gibson was lured back with a $30 million salary, plus 17% of the gross, the highest ever paid to an actor for a single project at the time, while Pesci agreed to $1 million for 3 weeks of work. Still, Gibson insisted his character be killed off, as he felt this should be the last Lethal Weapon movie, and was over playing the character. With the main cast starting to show their age, Warner Bros. Wanted to appeal to younger audiences, so they hired Chris Rock to play a new detective. However, there was just one problem. The latest draft of the script was nearly complete, forcing writer Channing Gibson to rewrite it in order to work Rock's character into the script. And the original plan for this character, Lee Butters, was that he was a gay detective, with Murtaugh worried that Butters had a crush on him. However, as they began shooting these scenes, the actors felt the storyline wasn't working, resulting in them pivoting to make Butters Rianne's husband and father to her unborn child. Still, remnants of the storyline remain in the film. At one point, 5 writers were working on the film at the same time, leading to a chaotic production, with actors receiving newly written scenes daily or having to wait on set for them to be written by hand. However, not only did Donner grow frustrated when Jet Li's moves were faster than the camera's shutter speed, resulting in them not even registering on film, but after watching Gibson and Lee rehearse the fight, Donner realized it would be unrealistic for an aging Riggs to defeat Lee's character. This led to the decision for the first time in the series to have Murtaugh join Riggs for the final fight. The shoot would be completed just under 2 months before the film's release date, putting enormous strain on the film's editor, regardless of the fact that he had been cutting while the film was still shooting. Still, the film would make it to theaters in time, and while it wouldn't be as successful as its predecessor, it was still the hit that Warner Brothers needed. However, the darker, edgier tone of the first 2 entries was almost entirely absent, with this installment leaning heavily into comedy. To return the series to its roots, Shane Black would be asked back to write the 5th film. But unlike most legacy sequels, Black rejected the typical approach of passing the torch to a new generation, where the legacy characters appear but take a backseat as the story primarily focuses on the newcomers. Instead, he did what Top Gun Maverick would do so effectively years later. Black insisted if Riggs and Murtaugh are going to be in the movie, they're going to be in the movie. I don't care how old they are. Titled Lethal Weapon 5, Body Count, the film would have opened with an older Riggs living a domesticated life just like Murtaugh from the first film, with his family even busting in on him in the bathtub to wish him happy birthday. Meanwhile, Murtaugh is retired, while his son Nick works as a cop in New York City on the other side of the country. Set during Christmas, the story would have followed Nick as he uncovers a plot by a private defense contracting firm who are smuggling Iraqi antiquities into the country to fund terrorism to keep them in business. Since both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars are dying down, these mercenaries are planning to assassinate the head of Homeland Security, frame a foreign power for it, and thus ignite a new war they can profit from. When Nick is set up, Riggs and Murtaugh head to New York during the worst blizzard in East Coast history to bail him out and stop the bad guys. The film also would have returned to the darker and more violent tone of the first 2 films, and kept the focus mostly to Riggs and Murtaugh, with Leo Getz, Butters, and most of the other secondary characters only showing up at the end of the film to celebrate Christmas together. The plan was for Shane Black to direct the film himself, but allegedly Mel Gibson turned it down. Later, director Richard Donner would speculate that Gibson turned it down because Donner wasn't involved. Eventually, Black's story would be thrown out, with Donner revealing that he and Lethal Weapon 4 writer Channing Gibson have an incredibly strong idea for a 5th film titled Lethal Finale. Unfortunately, Donner would pass away before the film could be greenlit. However, Mel Gibson has said that he plans to direct it himself, calling it the best one of the series. Thanks for watching, everybody, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Bullets and Blockbusters for more great content.